A cold and reclusive billionaire CEO gets a call from the social services. "Hi sir, someone dropped off a newborn here with your name and phone number. You need to come pick him up now." The man, initially dismissing it as a prank, freezes in shock when he learns the mom's name. The phone rang sharply, piercing the silence of Damien Cross's office. He glanced at the screen, expecting yet another call about the impending merger that had been the sole focus of his life for the past 6 months. Instead, the number was unfamiliar. His brow furrowed, and for a moment, he debated letting it go to voicemail. Curiosity, and the faint hope it might be an update on an urgent acquisition, got the better of him. "This is Damien Cross," he answered brusquely, his voice carrying the clipped efficiency that had become his signature. "Mr. Cross, this is Samantha Briggs from Social Services," a woman's voice replied, steady but laced with urgency. "I'm calling regarding a newborn baby that was dropped off at one of our centers. The child was left with your name and phone number." There was a long pause. Damien leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've got the wrong guy," he said, his tone dismissive. "I don't have kids." "We've confirmed the information, sir," Samantha continued, undeterred. "The mother left a note with the baby. It's quite clear. If you prefer not to take responsibility, we can arrange for foster care. That won't be necessary." He cut her off, irritation flashing in his eyes. "This has to be some sort of prank. I suggest you verify your facts before wasting my time." "It's not a prank, Mr. Cross," she replied firmly. "And if you don't come to collect the child, we'll proceed with finding a new home. But as the only listed guardian, we are legally obligated to notify you." Damien's jaw tightened. He loathed interruptions, especially ones as absurd as this. Yet there was something in the woman's tone, a quiet insistence that made it hard to dismiss outright. "Fine. I'll send someone," he said curtly. "Where's the center?" "We'll need you to come in person, Mr. Cross. It's protocol." Her voice softened. "This isn't the kind of matter you delegate." With a sharp exhale, Damien ended the call and stared at his desk, the sleek glass surface reflecting his sharp features. His assistant, Eleanor, knocked lightly on the door and stepped inside. She'd worked with him long enough to recognize the storm brewing behind his steely eyes. "Problem, sir?" she asked, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "Apparently I have a child," Damien said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Social Services wants me to pick it up." Eleanor's eyebrows shot up, but she quickly composed herself. "That's unexpected. That's putting it mildly," he snapped, standing abruptly and grabbing his coat. "Cancel my afternoon meetings. This shouldn't take long." The Social Services Center was a stark contrast to the polished world Damien inhabited. The waiting area was small and cluttered, the walls adorned with faded posters promoting foster care and adoption. Damien's presence was magnetic, his tailored suit and air of authority drawing glances from the staff and visitors alike. He approached the front desk, exuding impatience. "I'm here about a mix-up involving a baby," he announced. The receptionist looked at him, her expression neutral but curious. "Mr. Cross? Ms. Briggs is expecting you. Please wait here." Minutes later, Samantha Briggs appeared, a no-nonsense woman in her late 30s with a clipboard in hand. She led Damien to a quiet room, where a small bassinet sat in the corner. Inside was a baby wrapped in a soft yellow blanket, its tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Damien froze, unprepared for the sight. "This is Noah," Samantha said gently. "The mother left a note explaining that she couldn't provide for him. She named you as the father." Damien's first instinct was to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat. He approached the bassinet cautiously, as though the baby might explode if he got too close. Noah stirred, a tiny fist escaping the blanket to wave aimlessly. Damien's breath hitched, an unfamiliar pang tugging at his chest. He pushed it aside. "This is absurd," he muttered, turning back to Samantha. "There's no proof this child is mine. You can't expect me to take responsibility based on a name." We can arrange a paternity test if necessary, Samantha replied. But in the meantime, you are the only contact we have. The baby will remain here unless you take custody. Damien's lips thinned into a hard line. I'll make arrangements, he said, already reaching for his phone. My assistant will handle the details. Samantha frowned. This isn't a logistical problem you can outsource, Mr. Cross. This is a child. Exactly why I'm not the right person for this, he retorted. I don't have time for. He stopped himself, realizing how heartless he sounded. I'll ensure he's well taken care of. Samantha studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing. He's not just a project to be managed, Mr. Cross. I suggest you take some time to consider what's best for Noah, and for yourself. Back in his car, Damien sat in silence, the city skyline blurring as he stared out the window. Eleanor's voice crackled through the speakerphone. Shall I contact a private adoption agency? She asked. No, Damien said after a pause, surprising even himself. Not yet. The image of the baby lingered in his mind, the tiny fingers curling and uncurling, the peaceful expression on his face. It wasn't pity or obligation that stirred within him, it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. He ended the call and leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, Damien Cross found himself unsettled, the foundation of his meticulously controlled life beginning to crack. And in that moment, he realized this was only the beginning. Damien sat in the back seat of his car, staring out at the blurred cityscape, his mind looping through the events of the day. The image of the baby, Noah, refused to leave him. He could still see the tiny hands fidgeting in the soft yellow blanket, the barely perceptible rise and fall of his chest. Damien had always been good at compartmentalizing, at shutting out distractions and focusing on what truly mattered, his business. But tonight, his thoughts drifted in a direction he couldn't control. The car pulled up to his penthouse, and he stepped out, his expression unreadable. As soon as he entered, Eleanor was waiting, tablet in hand, her expression calm but assessing. The private investigators found her, she said without preamble. Charlotte Phillips. She worked as a waitress in a downtown hotel last year. Left shortly after, no forwarding address. They've tracked her down to a small apartment in Queens. Damien exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. The name stirred something in his memory, fleeting images of a dimly lit bar, soft laughter, and the kind of reckless escape he rarely allowed himself. He hadn't thought about Charlotte since that night. Now, she was at the center of a problem he never saw coming. I'll see her tomorrow, he said, his voice tight. Arrange it. Eleanor hesitated. Are you sure that's wise, sir? If you want, I can have the lawyers know. Damien cut her off, his gaze hardening. I want answers, not legal strategies. The next morning, Damien stood outside a modest, weather-worn apartment building, the complete opposite of the world he was used to. A flicker of something uncomfortable churned in his chest. This wasn't his arena, his carefully controlled empire. But here he was, walking into it anyway. When Charlotte opened the door, she looked nothing like he remembered. The playful confidence from that night had been replaced with exhaustion, her features gaunt and her eyes wary. She stood there for a moment, then sighed, stepping aside to let him in without a word. Damien took in the small space, threadbare furniture, dishes piled in the sink, and a noticeable chill in the air. He had no idea what to say to her, so he got straight to the point. You left a baby at social services with my name, he said flatly. Charlotte folded her arms, leaning against the counter. Hello to you too, Damien. Her voice held a tired bitterness. Yeah, that was me. He studied her, searching for any sign of deception. Why? She gave a humorless laugh, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. Because I couldn't do it anymore. I tried, Damien. I tried to be enough, to give him what he needed. But life doesn't work like that, not for people like me. Her eyes darkened. I didn't have any other options. You should have called me, he said, his voice sharper than intended. Charlotte's expression hardened. I did. More than once? But your people made sure I never got through. She shook her head. I left messages, emails, everything. Guess a waitress doesn't rank high enough to get a response from Damien Cross. For the first time in years, Damien found himself at a loss for words. He hadn't known. Or maybe he had and ignored it, dismissing it like so many other things that didn't fit into his life. I could have helped, he finally said, though the words felt hollow. Charlotte smiled sadly. Help? With what? Money? She shook her head. I didn't want your money, Damien. I wanted a father for my son. And when I realized that wasn't going to happen, I tried to do it myself. Her voice cracked, and she quickly looked away. But I couldn't. And I wasn't going to watch him suffer because of my mistakes. Damien's jaw clenched. He hated feeling powerless, but this conversation was quickly slipping beyond his control. So you just left him? He asked, his tone colder than he intended. Charlotte's eyes flashed with something between guilt and defiance. I left him with the hope he'd have a better chance. And it looks like I was right. If anyone can give him a better life, it's you. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. I don't know the first thing about raising a child. Charlotte sighed, running a hand through her hair. Neither did I. But you have resources I never did. Connections. I don't expect you to suddenly become Dad of the Year, but at least he'll have a shot with you. She hesitated before adding, I'm not saying this is easy for me either. Damien studied her for a long moment, his sharp mind trying to solve this situation like a business deal, but nothing fit into neat boxes here. What do you want, Charlotte? She hesitated, as if she hadn't allowed herself to think that far. I want him to be safe. To have opportunities. And maybe. Her voice softened. Maybe to know he was wanted, even if it wasn't by me. Damien exhaled slowly. I can provide for him. Financially. Charlotte's smile was sad but knowing. Of course you can. But Damien, money isn't everything. He resisted the urge to argue, to fall back on logic and figures, but something in her voice made him stop. He reached into his coat, pulling out a checkbook. I can set you up. Make sure you have what you need to take him back. Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line. I told you I can't. I won't. He needs more than me. A long silence stretched between them before Damien finally slipped the checkbook back into his coat. Then what am I supposed to do? Charlotte looked at him, and for the first time since he walked in, there was something like hope in her eyes. You figure it out. Without another word, she turned away, her posture stiff as she opened the door for him to leave. Damien stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of responsibility settling in his chest. He had walked into this place expecting an easy out, but instead, he left with more questions than answers. As he stepped out onto the street, the crisp air biting at his skin, a thought nagged at him, one he couldn't quite push away. Maybe, for the first time in his life, Damien Cross didn't have a clear path forward. Damien sat in the back seat of his car, staring at the city lights flickering past. Charlotte's words echoed in his head, a nagging weight that refused to be pushed aside. You figure it out. He had built an empire by solving problems, by making the impossible possible. But this wasn't something he could negotiate his way out of. Back at his penthouse, the floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering skyline, a view he once found comforting. Now it felt hollow. Eleanor was already waiting for him, a cup of black coffee in hand, her gaze measured. Sir, I took the liberty of scheduling a meeting with your legal team first thing in the morning, she said, placing the cup on the glass table. I assume you'll want to discuss relinquishing custody. Damien nodded slowly, sinking into the leather armchair. Yes. I want it handled efficiently. I don't have time for this. Eleanor studied him carefully. Understood. She hesitated before adding, Sir, may I ask? Are you certain that's what you want? Damien didn't answer right away. He picked up the coffee, staring into it as if it held the solution. What I want is for this to go away, he muttered. The next morning, his lawyers laid out the options in their usual precise, clinical manner, Damien barely listened, his mind drifting. Signing away his parental rights was the logical choice. The easiest choice. Yet when the papers were placed in front of him, he found himself staring at them, pen hovering over the dotted line. "Sir?" one of the attorneys prompted. Damien set the pen down with a sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I need more time," he said to his own surprise. That afternoon, social services brought Noah to his penthouse. The baby looked even smaller than he remembered, bundled tightly in a blue onesie. Damien stood by as the caseworker placed him gently in a bassinet, the polished floors of his home looking more sterile than ever against the tiny figure. "He'll be in your care temporarily while we process the final arrangements," the caseworker explained. "Let us know if you need anything." Damien barely nodded, watching as they left. Silence settled over the penthouse, heavier than before. He approached the bassinet cautiously, staring down at Noah. The baby's eyes fluttered open briefly, then closed again, oblivious to the cold stranger towering above him. Hours passed, and Damien remained distant, working from his home office while Eleanor oversaw the baby's care. A team of specialists had been brought in, nannies, pediatricians, child development experts, all efficiently handling every detail. Despite their best efforts, Damien still felt out of place in his own home. Late that evening, Eleanor entered his office, clearing her throat. "Sir, he hasn't stopped crying for the past hour," she said, exhaustion in her voice. "The nanny suggested you try holding him." Damien looked up from his laptop, his expression a mixture of annoyance and reluctance. "Isn't that what I'm paying them for?" Eleanor's lips twitched in a rare display of amusement. "Some things can't be outsourced, sir." After a long moment, Damien sighed and stood, walking toward the nursery like a man marching to his execution. The crying grew louder as he entered, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Noah's tiny fists flailed in the air, his face red and scrunched up. Damien hesitated, then reached down awkwardly, lifting him with all the grace of someone handling fragile glass. Noah squirmed in his grasp, but his cries softened slightly. Damien held him stiffly, as if unsure what to do next. Eleanor watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "Try rocking him," she suggested gently. Damien shifted his weight, moving slightly side to side, feeling ridiculous. Slowly, Noah's cries dwindled into soft hiccups, his tiny face nestling against Damien's chest. For a brief moment, something in Damien's expression shifted, something uncertain and unguarded. But as soon as Eleanor opened her mouth to comment, he cleared his throat and handed the baby back. "There. Problem solved." He turned and walked out, leaving Eleanor shaking her head. The days that followed were an exercise in frustration. Damien's pristine, minimalist home wasn't suited for a baby. The sight of diapers, bottles, and stuffed animals cluttering his carefully curated space irritated him. His routine was disrupted, conference calls interrupted by crying, important emails left unread because of sleepless nights. Each morning, Damien told himself he would call social services and finalize the adoption process. Each night, he found another excuse not to. One evening, after another failed attempt at sleep, Damien stood in the nursery doorway, watching Noah sleep peacefully. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "What am I doing?" He wasn't built for this. He had a company to run, a reputation to uphold. A child didn't fit into the equation. And yet there was something about the way Noah curled his tiny fingers around Damien's when he fed him earlier that day. Something unsettling. Something grounding. Eleanor found him standing there, lost in thought. "Thinking of giving up?" she asked softly. Damien glanced at her, the usual sharpness in his eyes dulled by exhaustion. "I should. But you haven't," she finished for him. "That says something, doesn't it?" Damien didn't respond. He just watched Noah's chest rise and fall with each breath, the gentle rhythm strangely soothing. A part of him, buried deep beneath years of calculated decisions and cold logic, stirred uncomfortably. By the following morning, Damien found himself standing in his office once again, staring at the untouched custody papers. He picked up his phone and dialed social services. "Yes, Mr. Cross?" the voice on the other end asked. Damien opened his mouth, prepared to end this once and for all. Instead, he said, "What would it take to keep him permanently?" Damien found himself pacing his office, phone in hand, as the sound of Noah's soft babbling echoed from the other room. He had officially taken temporary custody, yet the reality of it still felt surreal. His life was a carefully managed machine, every detail accounted for, every contingency planned. And now, there was Noah, a chaotic, unpredictable force that disrupted everything he thought he knew. Despite hiring the best nannies money could buy, Damien found his productivity slipping. Meetings were interrupted by the distant wails of his son, his carefully crafted schedule now dotted with pediatric appointments and calls from Eleanor reminding him to check in. His solution? Bring Noah to the office. His private elevator opened to the top floor of Cross Industries, the pinnacle of his empire. He strode through the glass doors with his usual commanding presence, the stroller pushed by Eleanor at his side. Employees exchanged uncertain glances, whispering as they saw the billionaire CEO, known for his ruthlessness, accompanied by an infant. Inside his sleek office, Damien dropped his briefcase on the desk and exhaled, rubbing his temples. Eleanor parked the stroller in the corner, looking uncharacteristically amused. "Well, it's not exactly baby-proof, but I suppose it'll do," she remarked. Damien shot her a glare before loosening his tie. "This is temporary. I have a board meeting in an hour, make sure he stays quiet." Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "He's a baby, sir. Quiet isn't exactly in his vocabulary." Despite the best-laid plans, things quickly spiraled. During the meeting, Noah's occasional gurgles turned into full-blown cries, causing Damien to shift uncomfortably in his seat as board members exchanged uneasy looks. He excused himself, stepping into the hall, where he awkwardly rocked the baby in his arms, glaring at Eleanor as she smothered a grin. By the end of the day, Damien was exhausted, more so than after a grueling negotiation. As he collapsed onto the couch, Noah squirmed beside him, his tiny hands reaching for Damien's sleeve. For a fleeting moment, Damien allowed himself to just sit there, feeling the strange weight of his son's presence. But reality hit hard the next morning. Damien's assistant knocked on his door, reporting a critical issue with an overseas acquisition. His first instinct was to delegate Noah's care to the nanny, but when he glanced at the baby, something tugged at him. He sighed and took Noah along. Balancing work and fatherhood was proving to be a nightmare. Conference calls were interrupted by sudden diaper changes, and Damien found himself losing focus, something that never happened before. The frustration was mounting, until one evening, everything changed. Noah had been unusually fussy all day, his little face flushed, his cries sharper than usual. Damien assumed it was teething or general discomfort, but when Eleanor picked him up and felt the warmth radiating from his tiny body, concern flickered across her face. "He's burning up," she said, looking up at Damien. "We need to take him to the hospital." Damien's stomach clenched in a way that was entirely unfamiliar. Without thinking, he scooped Noah into his arms and rushed to the car, his heart hammering in his chest. The sterile hospital lights, the smell of antiseptic, it all felt too real, too urgent. As the doctors examined Noah, Damien stood stiffly in the corner, his fists clenched. A flood of memories crashed into him, his own childhood hospital visits, the cold and distant way his parents handled such moments, always more concerned with their public image than with him. He remembered lying in hospital beds alone, staring at the ceiling, longing for a parent's touch that never came. And now, here he was, faced with the same scenario. But this time, it was different. This time, he was the parent. When the doctor finally returned, offering reassuring words about a mild infection, relief swept through Damien in an unfamiliar, almost dizzying way. As he sat beside Noah's hospital bed, watching his tiny chest rise and fall in sleep, something inside him shifted. Eleanor arrived shortly after, holding a cup of coffee she silently handed him. She sat across from him and studied him carefully. "You okay?" Damien nodded absently, eyes fixed on Noah. "I thought. I thought something serious was wrong. He swallowed hard, the weight of his fear still heavy in his chest. Eleanor offered a soft smile. Welcome to parenthood. For the first time in a long time, Damien didn't have a response. Back at home later that night, as he tucked Noah into his crib, Damien lingered, watching him sleep. His mind drifted back to his own father, a man who rarely spared him a glance unless it was to reprimand him. He remembered longing for approval, for warmth that never came. A slow realization crept over him. He didn't want to be that man. The next morning, Damien found himself staring at his reflection in the mirror, his usually impeccable suit feeling heavier than usual. He adjusted his tie, but his gaze was drawn to the bassinet in the corner of his room. Noah stirred, making soft noises in his sleep, and Damien let out a sigh. Eleanor entered, glancing at him with a knowing look. You have that big investor meeting today. Want me to arrange a sitter? Damien hesitated. No. I'll take care of him, he said, surprising even himself. The day passed in a blur of responsibilities, and though Damien still struggled, there was a newfound sense of determination in him. The cold detachment he once prided himself on was slowly thawing, and despite the chaos Noah brought into his life, Damien found himself adapting. That night, as Damien sat in his office, reviewing financial reports with Noah sleeping in a bassinet beside him, he realized something else, something terrifying and profound. He cared. And it terrified him more than any hostile takeover ever could. Damien sat in his office, the glow of the city skyline stretching out beyond the massive windows. His gaze drifted toward the bassinet in the corner, where Noah slept peacefully. The rhythmic rise and fall of the baby's chest should have been reassuring, but instead, it gnawed at him. The phone on his desk buzzed, pulling him back to reality. Eleanor's voice crackled through the speaker. Sir, the board is requesting an emergency meeting. They're concerned about your recent distractions. Damien sighed, rubbing his temple. Of course they are. Schedule it. Ever since Noah had come into his life, Damien's ironclad focus had begun to fray at the edges. He had done what he always did, thrown money at the problem. A state-of-the-art nursery was installed in his penthouse, complete with every high-tech gadget money could buy. He had hired a full-time pediatric staff, rotating nannies, and even a private chef specializing in infant nutrition. In theory, his life should have resumed its normal efficiency. But it hadn't. No matter how many people he hired, Noah's presence was a constant undercurrent in his thoughts. Damien would find himself checking in on him between meetings, listening for the soft cooing sounds that filled the once silent rooms. And then there were the moments when, despite himself, he lingered, watching the baby's tiny hands reach out, his giggles echoing through the penthouse. It was unsettling. He had built walls around himself for years, yet Noah's innocence had a way of slipping through the cracks. The next morning, Damien strode into the conference room, his suit as impeccable as ever, but there was an unfamiliar tightness around his eyes. The board members sat in their usual seats, a collection of hardened executives who had built the company alongside him. They were all waiting, their expressions carefully neutral. Gentlemen, Damien greeted, taking his seat at the head of the table. James Corbin, his chief operating officer and longtime rival, leaned forward. Damien, we're concerned. Your recent, personal situation is affecting operations. You've missed key meetings, and our investors are starting to ask questions. Damien's jaw clenched. I assure you, my personal life has no bearing on this company's performance. With all due respect, Corbin continued smoothly. You missed the closing call with the Hartman Group last week. That deal is now on shaky ground, and they're reconsidering our offer. Damien exhaled sharply, the weight of the statement settling over him. He had been at home that evening, rocking Noah back to sleep after a long day, and had completely forgotten about the call. It wasn't like him. He never forgot. I'll handle it, he said, his voice clipped. This company has always thrived under my leadership. A brief adjustment period doesn't change that. One of the older board members, a man who had been with Cross Industries since the beginning, cleared his throat. No one is questioning your leadership, Damien. But investors are concerned about image. You're known for your ruthless efficiency. If they perceive you as distracted, it could impact our stock. Damien leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. So what do you suggest? That I hand over my son and go back to the way things were? A few uncomfortable glances were exchanged around the table. We're just saying, Corbin said carefully, that it might be beneficial to reassess your priorities. A temporary leave, perhaps? Or delegating more? Damien's fingers tapped against the table. The old version of him would have taken their advice without question. But now, the thought of distancing himself from Noah left a bitter taste in his mouth. Meeting adjourned, Damien returned to his office, frustration simmering beneath the surface. Eleanor was already there, holding a report in one hand and a baby bottle in the other. How bad was it? She asked. They're worried I'm losing my edge, Damien muttered, pouring himself a drink. That I'm not the same man I was. Eleanor smiled knowingly. Well, they're not wrong. You're not the same. But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. He shot her a look, but there was no malice in it. Just exhaustion. They think I should step back. And are you going to? Damien glanced toward the nursery door, where the faint sound of Noah's babbling reached them. I don't know, he admitted. Later that evening, as Damien sat in the nursery with a tablet in hand, trying to catch up on missed emails, Noah reached for him, his chubby fingers curling around Damien's sleeve. Damien paused, looking down at his son, who was staring at him with wide, trusting eyes. It was such a simple thing, something Damien had never experienced from anyone in his life. Trust. Without thinking, he set the tablet down and lifted Noah into his arms, holding him close. The warmth of the small body against his chest was foreign, yet oddly comforting. Noah let out a soft gurgle, his tiny hand reaching up to touch Damien's face. A lump formed in Damien's throat, one he didn't quite understand. He thought of his own father, distant, calculating, a man who never once looked at him the way Noah did now. Damien had spent his entire life proving himself, building his empire, yet here was this little boy who didn't need any of that. He just needed him. The next morning, Damien arrived at the office earlier than usual, determined to prove to himself, and everyone else, that he could balance both worlds. But the universe had other plans. Halfway through an important negotiation, Eleanor burst into the room, her expression panicked. Sir, it's Noah. The nanny says he's running a high fever again. Damien froze, his blood turning to ice. Without a second thought, he stood, ignoring the shocked faces around the conference table. Cancel the rest of my meetings, he ordered, already moving. As he rushed home, Damien felt something shift within him. Work had always been his priority, the foundation of his life. But as he pushed open the door to the nursery and saw Noah's flushed face, all the deals, all the negotiations, they suddenly felt insignificant. He sat by Noah's crib all night, watching over him, whispering reassurances neither of them fully understood. And somewhere in the stillness, he realized something profound. Noah wasn't just a responsibility. He was his son. And for the first time in his life, Damien Cross felt something he never thought possible. He felt like a father. The nursery was dimly lit, the soft hum of the white noise machine filling the room. Damien sat in the plush armchair by Noah's crib, watching his son sleep. The fever had finally broken, and the relief that flooded him was unlike anything he had ever felt before. He had spent the past several hours pacing, holding Noah close, whispering reassurances as though the baby could understand. And maybe, in some way, he did. Damien ran a hand down his face, exhaustion weighing heavily on him, but for once, he didn't mind. For the first time, he felt like he was beginning to understand what it meant to be a father. The thought both terrified and comforted him in equal measure. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, when the sound of his phone vibrating broke the silence. Eleanor's voice was calm but firm. Sir, Charlotte Phillips is here. She says she wants to talk. Damien stiffened, his chest tightening. He carefully stood and walked out of the nursery, closing the door behind him. Downstairs, Charlotte stood in the middle of the living room, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of guilt and determination. She looked different than before, less defensive, more vulnerable. "Charlotte," he said, keeping his voice measured. "What are you doing here?" She hesitated for a moment, then met his gaze. "I made a mistake," she admitted. "I shouldn't have left him." Damien's jaw clenched, his fingers curling into fists. "You didn't just leave him, Charlotte. You abandoned him. And now that I've rearranged my entire life, you think you can just waltz back in?" "I was scared," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I thought I was doing what was best for him. But I can't stop thinking about him, Damien. He's my son." A sharp pang of fear shot through him, but he masked it with icy control. "And what? You want to take him back?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Charlotte swallowed hard. "I don't know. I just need to see him, to know he's okay." Damien turned away, running a hand through his hair. "He's fine. Better than fine. He's safe, cared for, and he doesn't need any more instability. I have a right to see him," she said softly. Damien spun back to face her, his eyes flashing. "You gave up that right when you walked out that door." Her eyes filled with tears, but she held her ground. "And what about you? A year ago, you didn't even know he existed. Can you honestly say you've put him first in all this, Damien? Or are you just trying to prove something to yourself?" The words struck a nerve, cutting deeper than Damien expected. "I've done everything I can for him," he said, his voice low. "I may not have planned for this, but I'm here. I show up. Every day." Charlotte took a step closer, her eyes searching his. "But can you love him? I mean really love him, Damien? Without conditions, without seeing him as another obligation?" For a long moment, Damien said nothing. The truth was, he didn't have an answer. He had built his entire life around control, around solving problems with precision and efficiency. Love was messy. It was unpredictable. And deep down, a part of him feared he wasn't capable of it. Charlotte sighed, sensing his hesitation. "I want what's best for him," she said softly. "If that's you, I won't fight it. But I need to be sure." Damien's grip tightened on the back of the chair. "And how do you expect me to prove that, Charlotte?" She shrugged, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "By making a choice. Him or the life you had before." Her words haunted him long after she left. Sitting in his office, he stared at the stack of legal papers in front of him, custody agreements, parental rights documents. One signature, and it would all go away. He could go back to his life. The one he built with relentless focus and purpose. The one without diaper changes and sleepless nights. But as he picked up the pen, a small cry echoed from the nursery. Damien froze. He placed the pen down and walked to Noah's crib, looking down at him. The baby stared up at him with wide, innocent eyes, his tiny fingers curling around Damien's thumb. Something inside him shifted, something undeniable. Later that morning, Damien stood before the board of directors, their eyes filled with concern and confusion. He cleared his throat, smoothing his tie, and then delivered the words he never thought he'd say. "I'm taking a leave of absence." A stunned silence filled the room. James Corbin leaned forward, disbelief etched across his face. "You what?" "I need time," Damien continued, his voice unwavering. "To focus on my son." The murmurs began instantly, a ripple of shock and concern. "Damien, this company needs you," Corbin pressed. "Are you seriously going to step away at a time like this?" Damien met his gaze steadily. "Cross Industries will survive without me for a while. But Noah won't. He needs me now." Eleanor stood at the far end of the room, her lips curling into a proud smile. The board didn't take it well. Some voiced concerns about public perception, others about the potential damage to ongoing deals. But for the first time in his life, Damien didn't care. He had made his decision. That evening, as he sat in the nursery with Noah in his arms, he felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The world outside could wait. His company could wait. For now, this tiny, fragile life in his arms was what mattered most. Eleanor peeked in, a rare softness in her expression. "You did the right thing, sir." Damien looked down at Noah, who blinked up at him sleepily. He nodded slowly. "For once, I think I did." Damien stood on the balcony of his new home, a modest yet elegant house on the outskirts of the city. The towering skyline was nothing but a distant silhouette now, replaced by the gentle rustling of trees and the occasional chirp of birds. It was a stark contrast to his former penthouse, where the hum of traffic and the pulse of power had been his constant companions. Here, the only sound that truly mattered was the soft, steady breathing of Noah, fast asleep in the nursery behind him. He made the move quietly, selling the penthouse without fanfare and transferring his responsibilities to a trusted executive team. The media had, of course, speculated wildly, their headlines screaming of a billionaire gone soft. But Damien found himself caring less and less. For the first time in his life, he wasn't waking up thinking about mergers or stock prices. He was waking up to the sound of his son's tiny coos and cries. Eleanor had been instrumental in the transition. She had stayed by his side, guiding him through the unfamiliar territory of fatherhood with the same unwavering efficiency she applied to corporate strategy. One morning, as Damien attempted to puree sweet potatoes in the kitchen, Eleanor leaned against the counter, watching with thinly veiled amusement. "You know you could hire a private chef for this," she pointed out. "I did," Damien replied, focused on the blender. "But Noah hated the food. This time, I'm doing it myself." Eleanor smirked. "Damien Cross, making baby food. Never thought I'd see the day." He glanced at her, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Neither did I," he admitted, setting a small spoonful on the high-chair tray in front of Noah, who stared at it suspiciously before making a face. Eleanor chuckled. "Looks like your cooking skills still need work." Damien sighed, but there was a hint of laughter in his voice. He never imagined he'd be standing in a kitchen like this, covered in mashed vegetables, but there was something deeply satisfying about the chaos. He had built empires with ruthless efficiency, yet convincing a baby to eat his lunch felt like the greatest challenge of his life. As days passed, the routines of fatherhood settled in. Damien learned how to change diapers without flinching, mastered the art of bedtime storytelling, and even found himself humming lullabies he never knew he remembered. But the corporate world wasn't ready to let him go so easily. One afternoon, while Noah napped in the crib, Eleanor sat across from Damien in the living room, her expression more serious than usual. "I need to talk to you about Cross Industries," she said, handing him a thick report. Damien set down his coffee, scanning the papers. His jaw tightened. "They're moving in, aren't they?" She nodded. "Corbin and a few of the board members are pushing for aggressive expansion. They think your absence makes you weak, and investors are getting nervous." Damien exhaled, rubbing his temple. He had expected this. His absence from the company had created a power vacuum, and men like Corbin were always eager to fill it. "So what's the worst-case scenario?" Eleanor hesitated. "A hostile takeover. They're courting outside investors, promising them more aggressive leadership. If they get enough backing, they could force you out." A familiar flicker of anger rose in Damien's chest. The company he had built from the ground up, the empire he had sacrificed so much for, under threat. His instinct was to fight, to return and crush any opposition before it could take root. But then a soft gurgle came from the nursery, and Damien glanced toward the door, his expression shifting. His old life was colliding with his new one, and for the first time, he wasn't sure which one should take precedence. Eleanor watched him carefully. "You don't have to go back, Damien," she said gently. "You've already proven yourself. You can let them have the company if that's what it takes to stay with Noah." Damien shook his head, staring at the reports again. "It's not that simple. I built Cross Industries with my own hands.